Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Climate Ideas from the Ministry for the Future, featuring local writer Kim Stanley Robinson, our Davis world-renowned science fiction and climate fiction writer. He is the first guest in Cool Davis's Spring 2021 series of climate speakers, presented by Cool Davis, Friends Meeting House, and YOLO Interfaith Alliance for Climate Justice. It's important at public events to honor the sacred land upon which we gather and those who have lived here before us. And Lynn Nittler is going to read tonight's land acknowledgement. Lynn?
Thank you. We should indeed take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we have been gathered, on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Putwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Putwin tribes. Kach-il-Dehi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Klitsel-Dihi Wintun Nation, and Yochu-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Putwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Appreciate that. So we have a few slides here for you this evening, folks. First of all, who to expect is up next, as well as what to expect. So myself and Michael McCormick, Megan Phelps, of course, our featured guest this evening. And then we will have Stan will be giving a 25-minute talk, followed by about 40 minutes for questions and answers. And then we will end the program this evening at about 8:30. So thank you for that. And then we'll move along now to what to expect. All right. We have, welcomed everyone, of course, again. Thanks so much. People are still streaming in, several hundred individuals already and counting. We just participated in the land acknowledgement. Thank you again, Lynn Nittler, for that. And then obviously the primary event for this evening, the discussion and talk by Kim Stanley Robinson, as well as a Q&A follow-up, but we will definitely move along to that in a moment. But I first want to introduce Michael McCormick, who is the president of Cool Davis. Michael.
Great, thank you, Lucas. I am so excited to be here, so excited to hear Stan talk about his latest work. Cool Davis is an organization. We've been around for about 10 years. We're 501c3. We host events, engagement opportunities across the city and across the region. We bring opportunities like this to the city of Davis and folks in the region. And we're excited to have so many people signed up for this event this evening. We're an active network of residents, community organizations, businesses, community institutions, and we have a memorandum of understanding with the city to help them implement their climate action and adaptation plan. They have a revision in process right now, which we're going to be actively supporting them on, and looking forward to working together to do deep decarbonization policies and programs and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Our mission is to inspire our community to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to a changing climate, and improve the quality of life for all. So we're actively looking for leadership in our community for the next 10 years. Please stay connected with us. You can take a look at the other work that we're doing in the city and across the region at www.cooldavis.org. Thanks again. And Lucas, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate. And I think it's just worth noting, again, that Cool Davis is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year and is a critical partner with the city of Davis in the work originally on our original climate adaptation plan. And of course, now 10 years later in the update to our climate action adaptation plan. So we're also this evening really pleased to introduce Megan Phelps. Megan is a senior honors student in environmental science and management at UC Davis. She is also pursuing an honors thesis studying possibilities for coalition building between organizations in the climate movement. She's founded and leads an active climate reality project at UC Davis, but since she's living at home in San Diego currently, she's also organizing and running a high school climate fellowship for 5 paid staff through sandiego350.org. She dedicates herself to empowering people to take action for climate justice to preserve the livability of the planet. Megan, we'd love to hear from you this evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for that welcome. It's such an honor to be speaking with all of you today. So I'm 21, which means I was born in 1999. The year after that, in 2000, an atmospheric chemist and Nobel laureate named Paul Crutzen coined the term Anthropocene to describe a new geologic era characterized by human intervention. Sadly, the industrial world only proved the validity of this term. In the 2000s, global emissions increased by 3 times compared to the 1990s. When I think of my childhood, I think of hours spent in my backyard, creating mud pies and tending to imaginary friends and children. I loved singing and finding earthworms. I saved bees from drowning and got stung by these rescued creatures. I played by splashing in the ocean, and I made stick fairies out of twigs and flower petals. When I was not even old enough to attend kindergarten, I knew I wanted children of my own. I loved the world I lived in, and unlike previous generations, I had the words to describe the dangers we were inflicting upon it. When I was 7, my independent research project was sustainable agriculture, and when I was 10, I became fixated on reducing my family's trash. Every year I lived, I learned new ways to speak about humanity's harms. As Kim Stanley Robinson describes in his book, the discount rate, which is just simple economics, indisputable numbers, made it clear that my future was not worth enough to save. And I started to question whether I wanted to have my own children. As I read The Ministry for the Future, I felt as if I was holding in my hands a vision for my adulthood. If this fiction were to come true, I would no longer be the young character indignant at the harms that my predecessors had perpetrated. I would be one of the grown-ups, and I'm here right now to tip the scales and change this fate. Though it's easy to blame generations that have come before us for the path we are on as a species, currently alive on Earth are 7% of people who have ever lived, according to the Population Reference Bureau. 7% of all people here at the same place in the most critical time in our species' history. People wonder what they can do to change the path of climate change, and I believe the most crucial thing to do is whatever helps them remember that right now, at this critical time, they are alive. That means writing and painting and getting our hands in the dirt to grow our own food. We have to embrace laughter and create community. It means demanding change, demanding that we decarbonize our energy system, electrify transportation, improve cement materials, increase family planning, and educate people. We must end wars, stop fighting, and move from a system of extraction to a system of care. It means speaking the truth, talking to our friends, marching in the streets, running for office, divesting, ending our unsatiable consumption, and challenging the values that got us here. I'm organizing a youth climate fellowship program in my hometown of San Diego, where youth just passed a resolution against fracking through their school district. I'm part of the UC Green New Deal campaign. We're demanding that the UC confronts its own carbon footprint. I'm biking and walking, eating mostly plants and not shopping at Amazon. And so when you leave this call, I invite you to write, paint, or draw the type of world that you want to create, either for yourself, your family, or the other creatures who will inherit this earth. Then set some intentions for your actions. What do you have to contribute, and what will you do? What we must all do to protect the fate of our futures is all we can do. And all we can do is celebrate the world we have and create the future we want by living it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate your comments this evening, and also, just reminded, while you might be just a little bit older than some of the folks who were a lot of the folks who are participating in the youth climate strike activities over the course of the past year or so, we saw so much of that activity in Davis, and we're so inspired by the work and seeing young people in Davis, but also all around the country and around the world speak out and really let us all know how we can be doing a lot better and a lot more. So thank you so much, Megan, for your poignant comments this evening. Appreciate it. Well, it's really my pleasure again, folks, this evening to introduce a friend of mine, a constituent. First of all, let me back up. My name is Lucas Frerichs. I'm the vice mayor of the city of Davis, a longtime supporter of Cool Davis. And I mentioned again that Cool Davis has been an integral partner with the city over the past 10 years. And yet there's a lot more work to do in the next several years and up to 10 years in the future for us in the city with the partnership of Cool Davis. But really appreciate them for all of their work and also for hosting this evening's webinar. I'm really honored to get the privilege of introducing both my friend, but also my constituent, Kim Stanley Robinson. Davis's own world-renowned sci-fi author. Stan is a longtime resident of Davis. He's a prolific author of over 20 novels, and increasingly his writing is considered part of a more recently coined genre known as cli-fi, short for climate fiction. I first came to know of Stan and his work and his writing after reading the Three Californias trilogy. Pacific Edge was my favorite, but it was the first, is years later that as a member of the Davis City Council, where our families have become friends, and I've relished the pre-pandemic opportunities where we've been able to share a meal, raise a glass, share stories and laughter together. While I soak up all the details he shares about his work, I've resisted the urge to pepper him with endless questions about what project he was currently researching or writing. And I've appreciated that while I'm pinching myself to be dining with this world-renowned author, he's felt comfortable in raising city-related issues of local importance with me, asking me my thoughts on how I'd approach attempting to resolve those issues. So it's an honor to have him with us this evening to share his penetrating thoughts about our world based on his latest book, The Ministry for the Future. His novel illustrates the likely disastrous consequences of climate change in the decades to come and offers hope that better technology and even politics might help us save the future. As he suggests, we're in a science fiction novel now, which we are all co-writing together. Ministry for the Future has been earning high praise, and even President Obama listed the Ministry for the Future as one of his, quote, annual list of favorites in 2020. I think it's important also to note that Stan is giving many free talks like this, amplifying the impact of his novel to move this country and the world towards climate action. So before I turn it over to Stan, just last quick reminder, submit your questions in the chat below. There are folks monitoring the chat. Do not submit in the Q&A section, submit them in the chat. People are curating the questions and we will, when we get to the question and answer section, we'll have an opportunity to get through a lot of those questions. But with that, again, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone here, welcome. Please join me in welcoming Kim Stanley Robinson this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lucas. And thank you, Megan, for your comments. Thank you, Lynn, for organizing this. And thank you to Cool Davis and for all of you who have joined us tonight. It's a pleasure to do something with Cool Davis. And as a really long-time Davis resident, I just want to express my pleasure in my sense of this town as a social group. It's a real town. So I'm going to organize about 25 minutes of talks around my book, The Ministry for the Future, just as a way to organize it, and then shift over to question and answer, as has been described. I started this book with the idea that there had been people suggesting that we would just adapt to climate change and that there was nothing we could do about it, or there was not enough we could do, and we were simply going to have to adapt to global average temperatures that might be 3 degrees Celsius or even more, and we were an adaptable species, and that's just the way it was going to be. And then I began to read scientific papers about wet bulb temperatures. So this is a heat index. You see it on weather channels. It's a combination of heat and humidity, pretty simple. And what it comes down to is humans evolved during a period of relative stability in the Earth's temperatures. And we are not capable of surviving a wet bulb 35 temperature, which is a combination of heat and humidity that is seldom reached anywhere on Earth in the modern era, but now we're getting closer. A couple times wet bulb 35 temperatures have been hit and recorded, and wet bulb 34s often, including just outside Chicago. So I began to get scared, more scared than I was before, that we are not going to be able to adapt, that the higher temperatures that will follow burning fossil fuels into the atmosphere at the speed that we're doing now will indeed cook us and cause mass deaths. Now, very quickly, also, I want to add to my sense of fear and urgency here by describing very quickly the fossil fuel situation. We can burn about 500 gigatons more of fossil fuels into the atmosphere before we will have hit the 2-degree Celsius rise that is already not considered to be perhaps higher than we would want. And yet, 3,500 gigatons of fossil fuels have been identified in the ground: coal, oil, natural gas. So, what this means is that there are 3,000 gigatons, that's a billion tons each, 3,000 billion tons of fossil fuels that if we were to burn them, we would have altered the planet in a way fatal to us. If that 3,000 gigatons were valued on today's marketplace, it would, this is entirely notional, it would be $1,600 trillion worth of money. Now, about 80% of the fossil fuel resources that have been found underground are under national control already. There are nation states that own their oil companies, and therefore that those fossil fuels are under their control. About 20% is under private control, 20 to 25, but all of that is usually on a sovereign land of nation states. So really, this is a nation state problem that we're facing. And yet, there are private executives and there are political figures representing their countries who will want to burn their last trillion for their own purposes, for the value of their own people that they are representing, before the rest of that fossil fuel becomes a stranded asset, so to speak, in financial terms. So we live in a world where capital is only invested to the highest rate of return available. This is like an algorithm. It's how finance works in the world today. Um, Capital does not get invested to the most moral place. It gets invested in the highest rate of return, as if the highest rate of return were an index of the most moral thing to do. But unfortunately, pricing is so poorly calculated that isn't even close to true. So um, because investment money, which means human time also, will only go to the highest rate of return. Since the highest rate of return is immiserating people and destroying the biosphere, we are therefore headed for a mass extinction event. And so all these factors together, I'm going to stop describing it because it's a known situation and move on to say, I decided, being a science fiction writer, and typically for much of my career, a utopian science fiction writer, which is to say, trying to portray good futures, let's put it that way. I wanted to tell the novel of the next 30 years passing in what would be now a kind of best case scenario. So that effectively dodging from where we are right now, dodging a mass extinction event, which really involves so many of the other species we share this planet with and would hammer us as well. Well, now this is kind of a new low bar for how to define utopian fiction, but that's where we are now. And I decided I would give it a shot. It needed to be a best case scenario that the reader could still believe might happen. So I wanted to cover about 30 years because it seems to me the next 30 years are critical to set us on one path or another. And I wanted to bring in all aspects of the problem, although maybe I could say the appearance of being about all aspects of the problem by a form that I sometimes call the kitchen sink principle, where you throw in everything and different forms as well. But I decided it was really important to emphasize the politics and the economics of the problem, because the truth is, if you consider technology very narrowly, narrowly to be the machinery, the infrastructures, the built infrastructures. We already have invented what could be a clean energy and a clean, which is to say, carbon neutral, possibly even carbon negative civilization on this planet. But we're nowhere close to it, and we don't have a political economic system that will pay for it to go to put it into place fast enough to save the day. So how are we going to switch from a system based on profit, where we essentially pay ourselves for doing the wrong things, destructive, to a political economic system that pays us as a civilization to do the right things to create sustainability and justice? Well, this was the problem for this novel. And I will say that also the mechanism, since this is a global problem and yet we are in a nation state system, I decided that a critical feature, both for my novel seeming plausible and for in our world, this plan seeming plausible, is the Paris Agreement. And indeed, it's quite a pleasure to be giving this talk a day or two after the Biden administration has rejoined the Paris Agreement. Although I want to maintain that we never left the Paris Agreement, because there is no mechanism to leave, and that was just um, a blather on the part of somebody that didn't know any better. So economics, it's a study, it's a discipline that quantifies what we do, um, but it's not. It's more or less automatically, as conceived in the disciplines today, in universities and in think tanks and in everywhere across it. It takes capitalism as a system, as a given, and studies it. It analyzes it. It does not speculate on different economic systems. That's not what economics as a field does. If you wanted a different economic system, you would have to go to a field called political economy. And political economy, you don't have a Department of Political Economy at UC Davis or anywhere else in this world, because that's considered to be kind of a 19th century matter, and especially since the fall of the Soviet Union and the creation of a single globalized neoliberal capitalist world order, it seems to have been taken for granted that the system that we're in is the only system that can possibly be. This is one of the famous lines from a neoliberal capitalist Margaret Thatcher: "There is no alternative." Well, that's a bad thought and not true, because there needs to be an alternative to get us out of this mass extinction event we're sliding into. And there's no inherent law against an alternative either. There's this sense that capitalism is the natural order of things is entirely constructed, and now it's falling apart. So what you need to look at is the study of the axioms that underlie a political economy. What's it for? If the single index used to calculate what an economy is for is profit, then you've got a problem. But if the fundamental system's underlying values are justice and sustainability, then economics as a quantitative discipline would be devoted to trying to figure out what we would do to create those axiomatic conditions that we're aiming civilization at. So I'm certainly, my novel Ministry for the Future is maintaining that only a form of post-capitalism, which will do the job here. And of course, this is a frightening thought, because right now we are in a global capitalist order. But it has tools, just as economics is a tool, and quantification and measurement are not at all bad things, but in fact are necessary things. In the same way, we are in a system that, although it is right now poorly designed to only try to create profit, even though that's short term and is destroying the biosphere, to a different set of axioms and see which part of the system could be immediately applied to doing better. And that's what led me in my novel to some features I'm gonna focus on for this talk as being maybe the main thing, even though my novel does talk about some other things I'll mention later. This is basically one version of post-capitalism that is being proposed, is sometimes called modern monetary theory. To me, this is just a Keynesianism, so a reversion to what John Maynard Keynes proposed during the Depression, that when the economy is doing poorly, government stimulates it. And in essence, a system that gives much more power to government than the neoliberal free market 40 years from 1980 till now has given it. In that system, there is a thing called carbon quantitative easing. So quantitative easing, I think, has become familiar to everybody. In 2008, somewhere between $5 and $10 trillion was created from scratch to return liquidity to a crashed economic system and avoid a depression. It worked, and people's faith in money, which is to say inflation or deflation, did not occur. And so when the pandemic hit last year, there was another big um, push of quantitative easing to create the money to reduce the suffering of this more or less instant depression that the pandemic laid on us. Now there is more talk, and indeed we are close to, I believe, passing a bill in Congress that will be signed by the president, $1.9 trillion as a kind of another push into the system. Carbon quantitative easing is the idea that if carbon is sequestered out of the atmosphere or not burned in the first place, in any way that carbon is drawn down rather than burned, that a payment would be made for that. A carbon coin, it's sometimes called, the carboni. These names are notional. There isn't a name for it yet. Although I notice that the Biden administration is talking now about SCC, the social cost of carbon, trying to put a monetary value on the damages of burning carbon into the atmosphere. A ton burned into the atmosphere creates, I've heard anything from $50 to $125 per ton should be surcharged in order to account for the social cost of carbon. It may be far higher. This is one of those new calculations that has to be made. So a payment for keeping into the ground is kind of like a carrot in a carrot and stick arrangement. So a stick would be, we take away your subsidies, which is an obvious no-brainer. Since the Paris Agreement was signed, about $2 trillion of government subsidies have been given to the fossil fuel industries. This is the success of lobbying and of politicians not doing the thing they've been elected to do. And so taking away subsidies, instituting a sharply progressive carbon tax, these are sticks. And then the carrot would be, if you were to not burn carbon that you had that you could, or if you were to draw it down from the atmosphere by any means, direct air capture, regenerative agriculture, the list is long of ways that carbon can be drawn out of the atmosphere, then you would be paid to do that. And suddenly the way in which money flowed through the economy would be flipped to doing good things for the biosphere rather than extracting things from the biosphere in a bad way. So combining the two, the sticks and the carrots, economists would say they're both just incentives, that they're effectively equal, and that usually it seems like the sticks work better on the humans than the carrots. There's a lot of other people, and I would be amongst them, that say that that's not quite right, that people do care about carrots that they would like to give. They would like to do good things and not just be punished for doing bad things, but rewarded for doing good things. And certain social scientists have made the assertion that both in combination are much more powerful in their effect on people than either one in isolation. So my ministry for the future is an imaginary body of the Paris Agreement, but I have to say that the Paris Agreement does include clauses that allows itself to create standing committees to get things done if they want to do that. I took the license to follow up on that suggestion, and the Ministry for the Future decides, following the same line of logic, that it has to go around the world and convince the central banks to back carbon quantitative easing. I want to make it very clear that it's the central banks have to back this with real money, fiat money, money that's backed by nation state systems. It's not a cryptocurrency, particularly not the horrible cryptocurrency of Bitcoin, which burns carbon into the atmosphere to make its value, which is a scam and presumably a bubble that I hope will pop soon. No, I'm talking about fiat money paid by governments out. And this again comes back to modern monetary theory. One of the two big pillars of MMT One, you can make new money from scratch. It doesn't destroy the monetary system, and it can be directed in its first payment to causes that the society wants to pay for. And then two, the job guarantee. This is the other pillar of MMT. They even capitalize it JG, job guarantee, that the government becomes the employer of last resort, so to speak, and that everybody who wants one can get a job. There is no more unemployment, no more wage pressure, no more fear of immiseration. You go to the government, you get a job. There is important and good work to be done, meaningful work, get paid a living wage for it. And then this uh, undercuts private industry's ability to underpay people, to scare people into working for less than what really keeps them alive, etc. It's an astonishing blow at the worst parts of the exploitative parts of capitalism, and really is one of the fundamental and easily achievable also in our current systems moves to a more just and sustainable post-capitalist system. So, um, yeah, good. Um, my novel also explores in kitchen sink fashion a number of other important points. What do we do with land? Well, there's a half earth thing from E.O. Wilson's book, Half Earth, that since people are congregating in cities anyway, and cities can be extremely energy efficient, and people want to do it, young people are moving to cities, it could be that that could be organized so that we left about half of the land surface of the earth, E.O. Wilson proposed, to the wild animals, which would dodge the mass extinction event by giving them room to live their own lives in their own way. I explored that. Then also direct air capture. We're burning so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that even though if we do everything right and run the table, we may want to suck some of that carbon back out of the atmosphere. So direct air capture is indeed a technology. It's still in the development phase, but there are no theoretical problems with it. It's a known chemical process to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Then you've got a whole lot of dry ice. It needs to be pumped back down into the earth. And ironically, oil industries have the technology to do that and could still be useful. They could indeed earn some carbon coins since they are now the owners of a stranded asset that is useless to all of us and even poisonous to us. And yet the oil industry could be put to use by way of carbon direct air capture. Then also, I even talked about geoengineering. If we go too far, if the planet gets so hot that people are dying in heat waves that they can't keep from killing themselves, then you have got a problem that some nation states may want to solve by direct action. And usually people talk about throwing dust up into the atmosphere to deflect a percent or two of sunlight away, which for about 5 years would work and then it wouldn't work. It's well understood because of the volcano at Pinatubo, the effect that it had in 91. So that too comes into my novel. And then all kinds of direct citizen action, nonviolent protest, violent protest, landscape restoration actions, small non-governmental organizations, and indeed everything that I could think of that seemed likely to happen in the next 30 years as we go through an incredibly turbulent time. I mean, really, Megan, your adult life is going to be an astonishing stretch of human history. And I suggested that by way of a whole bunch of eyewitness accounts, which function very nicely for giving a larger picture. So I want to end here very quickly by saying that I wrote this book in 2019. The pandemic hadn't happened and I didn't take account of it. At first, I thought that would render my novel kind of obsolete in advance. Now I think maybe it has, the pandemic, I mean, has allowed people to read this novel with a stronger sense that wild things like this not only are going to happen, but are already happening, that we're in the start of this novel. And so I think it has had that kind of an impact. And what I've seen is um, the central banks of the European Union, the Federal Reserve, China, they have all begun talking about carbon quantitative easing. They have indeed spoken in speeches that sound like they're taken directly out of my book, saying this: We are only here to keep money stable. We are not here to save the world. If you direct us, legislatures, humanity at large, if you direct us to create new money to pay for good carbon work, good biosphere work, we shall do so. But we are not legislatures. We have got one task. We stay in our lane. We try to avoid inflation and deflation. We try to help the unemployment rate where we can by monetary policy only. But we are here to act if you want us to act. Well, these are new statements. And then another thing, um, the European Union has declared that they would like to have 30% of Europe open to animals and without human presence. And that's already happening in places like the center of Spain, the center of Poland. The people are going to the cities, and they want to organize that. The 30% is rather astonishing, given that this is a new idea. And just last week, I read I think it was a tweet of all things from the Biden administration saying that they would like to organize the United States to be 30% open land. Please send us your ideas. They rather charmingly ended their quote. Uh, and so, and then MMT is in the discussion, and including crucially its job guarantee. If there is a giant stimulus, that which I think there will be, who how do you organize it? Who do you pay? You don't just give it to the banks. They don't need it. They're irresponsible owners. This would be like just pumping capitalism in the old ways. No, modern monetary theory has been bringing up the idea of the job guarantee. So to finish, um, my book has been out since last October. Um, it seems to have struck a nerve, and I might even say that people, it's becoming clear to me that people all around the world wanted a story like this in order to organize their thinking. It's a kind of cognitive map for people. Like, okay, I want good things to happen. I want to have hope. The situation looks bad. How could it possibly work out? People wanted any kind of a story like that. So the individual flaws, quite visible to me in any particular one book telling that story, are novels are famously a long prose narrative with a problem, and in my case, usually more than one problem. But it doesn't matter because the general lineaments of a best case scenario for humans and the biosphere in the coming decades is a story people want. So, all good. It's been great, and I think that what happens to people who read science fiction in general, and this novel in particular, is they have a better way of evaluating what's coming, and so they're better oriented, and it helps them to make decisions in their own lives as to what to do next. So with that, I will say 25 minutes and 4 seconds and pass it back over to Lucas with big thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Stan. Appreciate your talk very much this evening. And we, a lot to think about, certainly, and we've had a lot of folks already submitting questions in the chat. So while you take a second there, let's see, we're gonna get to as many different questions as we can this evening. Give me 1 second, just minimizing my screen here. So first question we have is posed by Larry. And so a little bit of a setup here first. I know you have supposed in your books that it will take big climate events to awaken the world to action. In Ministry of the Future, it is a heat event in India that sets off a world-changing actions. In other books, it's been the sudden ceasing of the Gulf Stream water flow or a sudden collapse of the major Antarctic ice sheet. Do you think only such an event will galvanize the world to effective action, or do you think a number of smaller events could do this, like the freeze in Texas or last season's fire season in the West?
Well, thank you for that. I think there's two parts to this. Human beings have a tendency to believe that it will never happen to them. So catastrophes can happen, and it's always somewhere else. It's always to somebody else. At the same time, the last 2 or 3 years have seen any number of catastrophes where everybody in California knew the state was burning down. Everybody in Australia knew Australia was burning. There have been floods. There have been torrential storms and unprecedented events everywhere. And what I think has happened is that we are already galvanized. And the kicker to that is the pandemic, where suddenly there was a situation that nobody could escape. And previously, when people talked about, well, we'll just pay our way out of it, um, you would have to point to rather esoteric problems like estrogen levels or sperm counts to say, no, you can't buy your way out of the environmental crisis that we're in. But the pandemic was like a sledgehammer. You didn't have to go into details. Everybody was living it. And so I think now the world is galvanized in a way never before. And climate scientists that I'm in contact with have been telling me the same thing. They feel that we're at a social tipping point now.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Um, let's see. So next question comes from Robin. Your book presents the idea that a global Earth-based religion would be of benefit as we transition to a just decarbonizing world. How would it be of benefit? And would its ethics countenance the terrorist acts that also appear to be part of an effective fight against the climate crisis in your novel?
No, I think the two are disjunct. There may be people that get so angry that they will use their religion to justify violence against other humans. I don't approve. My novel doesn't approve. There's a lot of descriptions of violence in my novel that I myself would not countenance, but I was fearful that it would happen if we don't act fast enough. As to the religious aspect of it, in Ministry for the Future, it is underplayed. I would say I was juggling so many balls in the air that the question of religion was like tossing a running chainsaw into the mix of things I was juggling. So it became a kind of a running joke. On a more serious level, I would say that my novels, Shaman, Green Earth, and The Years of Rice and Salt, are much more focused on our need for a religion that connects us back to taking care of the earth, and that ministry is more involved with the what you might call the bureaucratic, diplomatic, political, economic, and the gestures towards religion are, I think, notional, but in the right direction toward the oldest religion. Some people sometimes called shamanism, sometimes now called the Gaia religion, that the earth is our home and somehow there is something sacred about it, that we need to take care of it. So I think religion is important, that there's a big part of our brains that lights up like a hot lamp when you have religious thoughts and feelings, and that does need to be tapped into for this sense of one planet, and also humanity as one species that is all on the same side. That's a religious notion and needs to be brought into play.
Uh, Next question is from Scott, and it's I love the Carboni, the sort of the carbon coin. Do you see it emerging now, or any examples that you've thought of or that you know of that are out there?
Yeah, well, I spoke to this a little bit. Thanks for that, Scott. In my talk, Christine Lagarde made a speech about it. She's head of the European Union Central Bank, the head of the Bank for International Settlements, which is kind of a fossil from the League of Nations days, and yet it still exists. It's set in Basel, Switzerland, where they try to organize the efforts of all of the central banks. They've begun to try to gather discussions of this. The Federal Reserve has begun to talk about some kind of carbon quantitative easing. And then China has always used its central bank as a state directed mechanism for doing what they want. And they now want to go carbon neutral by the year 2060. So, yes, amazingly, you see this idea rather new to the world being discussed by the people who are going to have to do it and I think they're seeing the same problem that I outlined, that without it, we're doomed. So therefore we have to invent it. And that's what's pressuring them. And they want legislative and popular support for this idea because, as I say, they are technocrats, they're bankers, and they don't want to get out of their lane. But when you see them talking about it, you know it's a real idea in the world.
Great. No, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, I think we're seeing examples certainly, I mean, discussions happening even here in California in the legislature, and certainly I think now the Biden administration as well. I think we're going to start to see more of that. But there are a lot of unhappiness with sort of the cap and trade program here in California, and sort of thoughts about sort of just sort of a wholesale shift to carbon quantitative easing as an example. Yeah, thank you for that. This next question comes from Lynn. Writing about the climate crisis is usually serious and often discouraging. Why did you choose to write a hopeful climate crisis novel?
Well, I like to write hopeful novels. It's just, it's a challenge and it's a pleasure, and it's been a habit. So I would say that from Pacific Edge, which was 30 years ago, and hilariously to me, I wrote Pacific Edge and then moved to Village Homes in Davis, and thought that life was following art, although it had preceded it, but unbeknownst to me, it was a bizarre discovery that there were indeed progressive and communal suburbias in this world, because growing up in Southern California, I had no idea. Um, Now, a novel is a strange thing. I mean, we read them for fun, but we also read them for our sense of meaning, of what does life mean? I, like a lot of people, turn to literature for that as being the most sharp, most refined and granular of the meaning systems that exist for people. Literature is my religion, and I love the novel in particular, and it's what I do. Well, but they need to be fun. We read them for fun. We read them for a sense of pleasure, and it's not an actual binary opposition, um, entertainment and education. The two can reinforce each other. Aristotle said that in his early aesthetics, and Bertolt Brecht always insisted on it, that education can be more fun than you think, and that entertainment can be quite educational often. And indeed, when you watch Turner Classic Movies, you're learning more about the 1930s than if you read a history book about it. So it's helpful to be hopeful. I don't like dystopian fiction. It's self-indulgent, or it's wallowing in the obvious. If we do the wrong things, we are screwed. But after a while, stories about that begin to pall. And as I said, there's a desire for more hopeful stories out there. So it's worth a try. It's always worth a try.
The next question comes from Stephen. Among the aspects of your books that I've really enjoyed and that I'm also curious about is how your writing speaks of an incredible confidence in engineers and scientists, in people to meet challenges, whether they be construction, material science, robotics, geology, atmospheric engineering, molecular biology, or politics. Can you speak to whether the adversity of recent years has challenged or confirmed your outlook?
Well, the adversity of the recent years, maybe that's code for a ridiculously bad administration in Washington. Um, but also, there's been a lot of natural disasters and bad things happening. But let's just say this, underneath it all, the cultural manifestations, especially with the internet and social media, there's a lot of churn. There's a lot of what I would say soap opera. Underneath all that soap opera and all that divisiveness and all of that shouting, which often is carefully constructed to make people watch their social media even more. In other words, it's an advertised thing. Underneath that, science rolls on, progress is made. Uh, the questioner, was it Steve, mentioned material science. Rather astonishing what material science is doing. And engineers are always engineering things, which means they're always dealing with unknowns in their calculations and working things out anyway. The art of the workaround. I'm married to a environmental chemist who works for U.S. Geological Survey. I'm a big fan of federal science, which has continued to grind along even against the vandalistic attacks of the last 4 years of the administration. There's still a tide or a groundswell or a current of good human work that is being done in the sciences. And if we were to take advantage of that in our social organization, in our political economy, and put that good work to use, it would be amazing. We would progress even faster. I believe, and I'm quoting the scientists here, that a human civilization of 8 billion people um, could have food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, and electricity for all at adequacy, and that the wild animals would be equally at their adequacies, and that all that could work out at the level of the physical flows involved. And so it's not, science is to me the great living, already existing utopian force in society. So I write science fiction because I'm a fan. I'm aware that problems can exist in science, of course, everything from hubris to underfunded to misapprehensions of reality to not understanding the importance of everybody being treated equally, et cetera, because it's a human institution. It has its flaws. But the project of science and the way that it's conducted in its methodologies, and I don't just mean hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion. I mean the institutions, the nested group of institutions that make it all run and obtain the funding and educate the people that do it. Well, it's admirable. It's a kind of government already that is running parallel to our more normally considered governments. And I'm all in favor of more. And I think it could solve our problem, along with that dollop of religion, that emotional drive of religion that I also talked about earlier.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. The next question comes from Steve. How do we begin to convince doubters that climate change is real? Every time there's a strong cold spell, for example, it gets them all claiming that it disproves global warming. It seems if we can't move the public dialogue, then it will be hard to get consensus to make actual change.
Well, I know what Steve is talking about here, and yet I believe that this is now an issue that has been, that reality has overthrown this issue, and we're now into the next set of problems. I think that, first of all, there's going to be a stubborn minority of people who will declare that they are right no matter what the evidence is, and they can't be swayed, and you might as well give up on them. But they are a minority, a very small minority. Some of them have enough money to try to use disinformation techniques to confuse a larger part of the public. But as for real believers that climate change is not a problem, I think they're mostly gone. I mean, almost entirely gone because of what's happened over the last 10 years, because of not just the data the scientists have gathered, but the realities of what you can see on television. One thing I always like to point out is that glaciers, that ice on this planet is just like a thermometer, and that the glaciers are melting, the ice caps are melting. The Arctic Ocean sea ice was 30 feet thick when submarines measured it in the 1950s, and now it's sometimes not even there. These are just thermometers sitting there staring you in the face. So climate skeptics, this is partly contrariness, partly political conviction that they don't like the scientific party, which is to say the Democratic Party. And then what happens, however, is that having given up on that, okay, climate change is happening, but it isn't humans who did it. Well, that's obviously a weak reed to stand on because of all the carbon that's being burned and the numbers that can be pointed to. The science is very clear there. You can do experiments in a third grade class and show it happening. And it's been known since the 1830s, the effect of this. So no, people are shifting to doomism. This is what Michael Mann calls it, the climate scientist at Penn State. So you're a climate skeptic. It's not really happening. Oh, but wait, it is happening, but there's nothing we can do about it. So we're all doomed. So let's go ahead and burn carbon anyway. Let's go ahead and party. There's nothing we can do. So this has to be fought against, but doomism is a weak reed too. This is a naturally disgusting position to take, and I don't think the young people will stand for it. So the people who are fashionably cynical or pessimistic by nature, they're going to get shoved aside by a young and hopeful band of young people who want a world that they can live in and perpetuate. So I guess to bring it to a close, and I've gone on too long on this, climate skepticism is a dead letter, and we're on to the next stage.
Thank you. No, thanks very much. Appreciate that. The next question is from Rob. Your books have predicted events in the future several times. In Ministry of the Future, or Ministry for the Future, you have a passage saying that a true narcissist, if they do not get what they want, will pull down the whole system with them. My question is, what were you thinking with the attack on the Capitol building on January 6th?
Well, I was like everybody else, I think. I was quite shocked. My main shock was having lived 4 years in Washington, D.C., it struck me that the Capitol is a very easy building to defend. So my main shock was, how the heck is this happening? Why wasn't there a proper defense given of the Capitol? And that made me scared. I suspected collusion, which I no longer think was the case. It was more lack of guidance from the top, and then a kind of fumbling of people in disbelief. Maybe they hadn't read enough science fiction, including the science fiction that predicted this very thing from a right-wing cheering it on perspective. If you're not aware of what might happen, you're not good at preparing for it. As for the narcissism involved, well, this was obvious. I mean, I wrote Ministry for the Future in 2019, and so I had a shining example of the Goethe-Damerung syndrome. But I want to say Goethe-Damerung capitalism is a real force in this world. There are many people who are maybe a little bit too entitled in their feelings, too privileged, too rich, and too stubborn, and nobody likes to admit they were wrong. They'd rather go down in flames than admit they were wrong. There's a stubbornness in all of us. So it was easy to write that particular passage in the ministry in 2019, and that day at the Capitol was shocking, but I wonder if it was represented some kind of low point or benchmark or turn of the tide. It's impossible to say right now, but I think the shock of that was severe enough that maybe we'll see good things come out of it in a reactive way.
Thank you. The next two questions are actually fairly related, so I'll read them both. So Andrew writes, do you think the problem is solvable in a system of nation states ruled democratically that is ruled by regimes that are designed to work by compromise? And Camille writes, what political economic system could address the core problem of externalities?
Wow. Well, those are good. We are in an awkward situation that is unchangeable, which is to say the nation state system. And the reason that I wrote the Ministry for the Future the way I did was because that 178 nations signed the Paris Agreement. And in the Paris Agreement, there's an intense attention paid to climate equity, that the rich nations will pay more and support the developing nations, very often hammered by the colonialism of those same rich nations historically, that this climate equity will constitute a little bit of historical justice and a final decolonialization. And it will happen by treaty of an international treaty of nation states. Now, this is awkward and scary, and it has to be admitted that the Paris Agreement could become like the League of Nations, a good idea that failed and led, therefore, to war when the failure happened. Or the Paris Agreement could be the scaffolding on which we build something solid going forward. And every single nation state, especially the big petrostates, Russia, the United States, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Australia, Mexico, Indonesia, there are some more, China. Well, these big petrostates, could each one of them blow up the world? But they're in the same room that they would be blowing up. So it would be we have a kind of a weird fossil fuel mutual assured destruction, and everybody signed that agreement. So that's the political part of how I think we solve this problem. It would be nice if there was a better way, but it's the best way we got. As to the political economy, it's really what I was talking about. A stepwise system where first you go from austerity and neoliberal capitalism, dismantle that, anti-austerity, return to Keynesianism, that's kind of MMT, then maybe social democracy as in Scandinavia, then maybe democratic socialism. These names get more emotionally weighted And it seems to me the future might end up with a political economy that is so different from all of the previous ones that it doesn't have a name yet. This is why I call it post-capitalism. But let's put it this way, that we organize ourselves to pay ourselves to do good work for people and for the biosphere, for justice and for sustainability. However you achieve those axiomatic purposes, you get to name it what you want. Name it Cool Davis.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. I think I hear the campaign slogans now. So can massive tree planting save us by soaking up carbon and cleaning our air, plus supporting species that could otherwise become extinct?
It could be one part of a much larger policy. The tree planting is great. And in fact, if you fly over the Pacific Northwest, if we get in planes again, and you look down at Oregon and Washington State, we devastated those forests in a way that makes the Amazon looks like child's play. It's one of those ironies that first the North wrecks their own forests and clear cuts them in big squares. You see it when you look down, and then goes to the global South where people are really immiserated and says, don't you touch your forest. That's the lungs of the world, as if we didn't kill our lungs. So tree planting is great, but there is so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that if you were to try to draw it down by tree planting alone, you would need more land than we have. You would need to try it in deserts where it won't work. You would need to take over farmlands where we want the food. So it is one part of a larger carbon drawdown process. It's a good one. It's important. It would be great. Endangered trees, I don't really think of them as, I'm not scared for them the way I'm scared for endangered mammals and other species, but of course I should be. So yes, one part, but consider that perhaps I've heard some scientists say that if you planted trees everywhere we could, you might only draw down a quarter of the carbon that you want to out of the atmosphere. So it's necessary, but not sufficient.
The next question is from Roberta. In the Ministry of the Future, you mentioned regenerative agriculture. Is that something we could do in and around Davis? Are there other actions, or what are the other actions that you think we should be taking locally?
Well, I think regenerative agriculture is one of the great projects of our time. And, UC Davis is one of the 2 or 3 best agricultural universities on earth. We are a world power here in Davis because of UC Davis's agricultural department. It's rather galling for all the other departments, but it happens to be true. And one of the signal achievements of UC Davis agriculture department was the invention of the Green Revolution in the 1950s and 60s. Cornell, UC Davis, a few other places, they did the work there. Now, the Green Revolution created a whole lot more food by way of carbon burn, nitrogen and carbon, using it as oil to fuel tractors, using it as fertilizer, basis for fertilizer. This was a development that looked good in its time because of the threat of starvation and rapidly growing populations. Now it looks like it's also part of the problem. And although it's very true in science that sometimes advances in science will lead to such improvements that we get secondary problems, like simply more people to deal with. And then you have to deal with those problems in the next iteration. What I'm saying is UC Davis should be inventing regenerative agriculture. And some people there are. And other people are saying, well, that'll never work. And they're kind of stuck in the Green Revolution paradigm. But on the other hand, they're retiring or dying, because that's quite a ways back, the Green Revolution. Now it's regenerative agriculture. It's very important. I've been talking to people at UC Davis, some of them friends. There's a lot of room for drawing carbon down into the soils, but it's asymptotic. And after you make some quick improvements, get some carbon back into the soil, you get into a balance where it isn't that easy to draw down more. So again, it is one part of a suite of solutions. There is no one silver bullet. Every single one of these methods is going to have to be worked on. It's what I call the all hands on deck response. All hands on deck. Everything should be tried. But what's great about regenerative agriculture is we need food. And if we can make food and draw down some carbon, or at least not burn carbon into the atmosphere by our ag, that's two good things that are twinned together into one bigger, better thing. So I can't help but love regenerative ag, although I realize the people working hardest on it are sometimes rolling their eyes and going, hey, we're doing the best we can, but physics is involved here, biology is involved here. And it's not as easy as just saying the words and then clapping your hands.
The next question comes from Pamela. She says, the parish I lead, St. Martin's, has become a, quote, zero carbon church, quote, and we are now thinking about what's next. How do we making a positive difference, not just lessening the harm we do? One avenue we're exploring is having churches become climate resilience hubs. Can you comment on the idea of creating climate resilience hubs, and if you think it's a good direction for local organizations and or governments to take? The early chapters of your book seem to suggest that this might be a, quote, too little too late approach.
Well, no, nothing's too little too late. I would say I love St. Martin's and help my wife, who helps the meals that they do on Tuesdays and Saturdays there. So I know it well. And it's already doing such good in Davis for our homeless population. And a lot of people are working hard on that problem. And when I help my wife working in this problem, it makes me very angry, because it seems to me that it's great that people are doing this out of the gift economy and because it's needed, but it makes me angry that it isn't an automatic government thing that we've done as a society, that these people aren't homeless in the first place. And also that if you're mentally ill, you're in terrible trouble in this country for no reason that you caused yourself. So I do it anyway, and I very much admire St. Martin's. So to get to your point, climate resilience, we might need air conditioning spaces. We might need places with filters to filter the air when in big fire. We obviously do need feeding people and free meals. So yes, these, in the failure of our national and state governments to do these things as part of a legislated process, then we do have to pick up the slack. And it's never too little too late. It's actually sticking your finger in the dike and hoping that the dike gets repaired.
Appreciate that, yes. Next question is from Andrew. Can there be a solution without addressing right sizing to a sustainable world population?
Well, yes, I think so. And I'm following the scientists here. 8 billion is probably an overshoot. And it could be done if we were to run the table and everything was done right. And I always assume a population of 8 billion, which we're very much at now, with the idea that the growth of human population is leveling off fast and could by policy be leveled off, and then the human population begin to drop. And the policy, it's another one of these paired goods. It's simply women's education, women's property rights, family planning worldwide. When that happens, we've seen it, demographers have seen it. When that happens, the replacement rate is 2.1 kids per woman. It drops to like 1.5 in countries that are prosperous and where women are educated and have all of their legal rights, which are already guaranteed by the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So in other words, residual patriarchy, wherever it is, it's got to go down. And women have to be the equal of men everywhere on this planet. And when that happens, population will drop. Now there are people discussing, could we get to a 1.5 worldwide replacement rate by 2030? Well, we probably could. And this is interesting because at that point, we have interesting problems like fewer people. Well, it means full employment, that's for sure. It means everybody's prosperous. It means there's less of hammering on the biosphere. People talk, maybe it should be 3 billion. Maybe that's the best number. I mean, these are highly hypothetical discussions, very much in the realm of utopian science fiction. What would be best? But that's again, that's a tipping point into a new conversation than the doomism or just the fear that we were going to run right through the earth like a a flock of locusts, devastate everything, die off ourselves all over. Well, no, it's a little bit more under our control than that. And I do want to say that it's important to bring population back in the discussion in these positive terms. Simply by supporting women, we get a lower population. So it's a paired good. You don't have to be afraid of talking about human population as if it was immediately leading to population control, eugenics, fascism, etc. That's a false a syllogism. It doesn't follow from the actual situation that we're in right now. So I'm glad that this questioner brought that question up.
Great, thank you. How important is it to reduce air travel in the larger struggle to reduce carbon emissions and create a sustainable society? Do you have your eye on other technologies that might replace air travel?
This is a good question. In one's personal carbon burn, which I think everybody should run the numbers on this for themselves. You live in Davis, and if you garden, compost, bike to the downtown, you can have quite a low carbon burn here for a suburban, for an American, and particularly a suburban American middle class. It's rather astonishing. And then you take one plane flight, and boom, you've suddenly your carbon budget has been blown apart by that one plane flight. I'm kind of astonished. On the other hand, they're very heavy things to keep in the air for 10 hours, et cetera. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'm an English major. The physics of these things sometimes eludes me. I like going other places. I'm wondering if we could do it in electrical forms. I'm wondering if we could do it less casually, make it more, when you do it, that it becomes important, that maybe you sail there. Maybe you take trains or drive an electric car to some shore and then sail to another continent and slow down. So I'm interested. Certainly in the Ministry of the Future, they all ended up in airships with big solar panels on their top sides and little humming electrical fans pushing them along at about 100 miles an hour, and people are poking around, and it's back to like ocean voyages across the Atlantic in the late 19th or early 20th century. So say it takes you, a week or 10 days to get to Europe, and you're up in the air looking at the Earth and having a party. I mean, this is a little bit of a compensatory fantasy on my part because I like Europe and the rest of the world too, and would like to visit it. And I think young people should feel free to visit it without feeling guilty. So it's an open question. It's one of the problems of our time. But this is literally kind of a first world problem. So I don't know that we need to go into it too much more.
There are already climate refugee situations happening and occurring around the world. What do you envision will happen with the throngs of people seeking refuge in a world scared of immigration? I apologize. This is a question from Ingrid.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. It's a good question because it's a dangerous situation. Nobody leaves their home unless they're desperate, like they're going to get killed or they can't live there or their kids are going to starve. And then you've got refugees, and we treat them like prisoners. I did a lot of reading for the Ministry for the Future about this issue. And one thing I came across, I find rather encouraging, and this is the Nansen passport. So after World War I, there were millions of people wandering Europe whose lives had been shattered, and they had no papers. It wasn't clear what country they were from. They often didn't want to say. And so Fridtjof Nansen was brought in by, it was not quite a League of Nations thing, and I think it maybe Treaty of Versailles, 1918. In any case, Nansen set up a system of papers. Everybody had a Nansen passport. They could live wherever they wanted to. And I have the feeling that we're going to get into a climate refugee problem. If it gets severe, that those people need to be given the same human rights as everybody else. And something equivalent to a Nansen passport where you have the legal right to live anywhere is probably going to have to be generated. And then this is, I'm reading a book called Utopia for Realists by a Dutch philosopher who I'm very ashamed to say, I can't remember his name right now, but I just got the book. And one of his ideas is open borders. Everybody should get to live where they want. And at that point, you readjust accordingly. And so that may be one of the ways that we have to deal with people moving, because the changing climate has forced them to move.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, actually, it's Rutger Bergman is the author of Utopia for Realists. Appreciate that. Let me go back here to my apologies. So let's see, next question from Larry. What do you see as the best strategy to get elected officials to move in the direction you're proposing?
Well, I would write your congressman, telephone them, calls. The people who actually call and write any political representatives are a small percentage. And so, and also, but the political representative, and maybe you can confirm this for me, Lucas, are attuned to the feedback that they get as being representative of the people that aren't bothering to get back in touch. So if you are an active citizen and you contact them, then that helps to push their thinking in your direction. Also, voting them out of office when they do stuff that clearly suborns the reason that you sent them there, because elections happen pretty often, and doing that consistently and telling people why. And then also, gosh, campaign reform. I mean, Citizens United, obviously we have a Supreme Court that isn't going to overthrow that anytime soon. And yet money is not the same as speech. And so this is one of the projects of our time. And at this point, I don't see any recourse except to beat them at the polls like a drum. And at every election, try to win by 60% so that you overmaster the gerrymandering, the voter suppression, and you win the election even despite all of these vandalistic methods to slow you down, and fight it left, right, and center so that there are fair elections, and then win the elections and put the politicians' feet to the fire to do what they've been elected to do, and then elect politicians from the left who are progressive, who will go in there and do progressive things. California is a pretty shining example right now, and of course we have horrific problems in California still. Inequality is huge here because we're in a bigger system than the California system, and we can't solve all problems at the local level. Not even California can solve all California's problems by unilateral action because we're in a bigger economy that is radically unequal. And yet you do what you can all up and down the line, from the town councils and the planning boards, for instance, all the way up to the presidency and the in the European Union. You would focus on the legislators that go to the European Union itself. They are also elected by popular election, but they never do what they were sent to do. So yeah, it's a problem and something to keep on hammering on.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, and I certainly can confirm the issues both as a local elected official, but also having worked for a long time in the state legislature, that when elected officials hear from constituents, that's sort of extrapolated out that each individual that they hear from represents X times more actual constituents in the similar concerns. So absolutely, that is totally confirmable. Thanks for your other thoughts on that as well. So next question is from Joe, age 16, actually. Would you agree that overenthusiasm in technological revelation is potentially precarious and that it could generate unforeseen humanitarian or ecological consequences?
Well, sure, but I want to say this. We are a technological species. And by that, I mean, before there was even human beings, our precursor species were using tools and fire, and that coevolutionary process turned them into human beings. So technology can be used as a fetishistic word. You could say, oh, well, technology will solve all our problems. Well, we are a technological species. So, we need clothes, we need, bone needles suddenly in the archaeological record. Right after we find bone needles, we find people living 20 latitude degree lines further north, et cetera, just from warm clothing. All these technologies are can be used for good or ill. And amongst the technologies, you have to include the software. So politics, economics, justice, uh, laws, language itself is a technology. And at that point, I think what it does is it blows up that argument. Do we need to worry about technology? Well, yes, but it's what we do. So then we have to carve our technology to a better purpose and shape it by way of philosophy, by way of axioms of our value system. That if those two are technologies, those might be the crucial ones.
Just a quick time check. We have about 5 more minutes for questions. And so there are a lot of questions still, so I'm trying to get through them all. Next question is from Natasha. I've noticed that you use Switzerland quite a lot. In the Mars trilogy, they're a helper along with Praxis and Ministry of the Future. Obviously, that is where the ministry is based, but I wonder why.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm going to go into speed mode here and say that my wife got a postdoc after her PhD at UC Davis. Her postdoc was in Zurich, Switzerland at the ETH, the technical university there. We spent 2 years there. It's now the 35th anniversary of our time there. And I'm happy to report, and I'll end with this, that people in Zurich have noticed that the Ministry for the Future is set in their town. So I've been writing, I don't know, you might even call it memoir newspaper columns for the Zurich newspapers about our time in Zurich, which really is the last thing I thought I would ever write, but it's kind of been a beautiful experience.
Just as long as you promise them that you're not allowed to move there. Okay, we have that understood. Stan, okay, good, excellent.
Just vacations,
Excellent.
Airbnb. We have to walk there. We have to take a sailing ship there. So we might be away from for a year, but we won't move there.
All right, excellent. The next question is from M. Trumbull. Is the character of Mary based on particular people?
Oh, good question. Yes, I based her on Mary Robinson, the Irish. She was Irish president, which is a ceremonial position, and then she did a lot of work in human rights in the European Union. People told me that she might be. It's a little bit too close to the bone, so I changed the name at the last minute to Mary Murphy. And I've now met Mary Murphy, an Irish woman who's been on the Davis City Council. I have met Wales's Minister for the Future, who is a woman. And I'm in general, what I'm seeing is, and I'm very pleased to report that middle-aged women running this world for the better has been, they kind of like this book, and I kind of like them. So it's a mutual admiration society. And there are many. I think it was a good move. I like her as a character.
Great, thank you. Next question comes from Jan Bordstad. Project Drawdown ranks the effectiveness of various actions we can take. Highest on that list that an individual can do is eating a plant-based diet. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's important, and that's right. I do want to add, however, that Extinction Rebellion and some other movements have been trying to make the point that eating is quite personal, and you should let people eat what they eat, and maybe try to suggest these things without being very dictatorial about it or condemnatory, because people really are devoted to that particular habit. I personally, in my own life and in what I advocate, I say, stop eating beef. And when you're eating pork, it's cannibalism, but that's okay. We've been cannibals before, but know what you're doing. Birds, they're dinosaurs. Maybe we evolved as omnivores, but we got a planetary problem. So shift to a plant-based diet as much as you can, and be mindful. This is what the Dalai Lama is always saying: be mindful. Everybody consumes, everybody burns carbon, but if you be mindful about it, you can reduce it without. I'm very distrustful of the Puritan motive in Americans and of purity in general. So I want to take that point without becoming completely vegan myself.
Great, thank you. So we have about one more question here. There are a lot more questions, but just since we're supposed to be ending the sort of Q&A section around 8:25, we'll time for one more question, and it comes from Susan. Your book was not just thought-provoking, it was also a terrific story and a great read. What comes next for you?
I am writing a nonfiction book about backpacking in the Sierra Nevada of California. It's one of my favorite things. I've been putting this book off for many, many, many years. Ministry is like a swan song or a mic drop, or at least I'm completely out of ideas. I want to write more novels, but in the meantime, this Sierra Nevada book, being partly history, partly memoir, partly geology, partly I don't know what, it's very absorbing. I'm enjoying it a lot. It's been my pandemic project, so it's almost done. So that's what I'm up to, and I'm quite excited. It'll have photos, it'll have maps and schematics of the Sierra formation, etc. It's new to me and quite exciting.
Excellent. Well, great. Thank you so much. Looking forward to that, certainly. Well, thank you, Stan, so much for all of the Q&A this evening, all the excellent questions from folks attending, still well over 200 people still in attendance this evening. And thank you for just writing a novel that will guide us toward a better future and for addressing the questions this evening. Finally, before we close out this evening, just want to thanks to all the audience for joining us tonight. Please be sure to come back on March 23rd at 7 p.m. to hear UC Davis professor Mark Reif on climate change and capitalism. You can read more and register next week at cooldavis.org/news. The climate talks will continue with 2 more talks later this spring. And then also, as sort of some final words, you'll be receiving a link for the Cool Davis YouTube channel recording of this presentation in a day or two. And obviously we'll work forward with Cool Davis. Will be continuing the discussion of how we can slow climate change and work to implement some of the items that we talked about here this evening. So thank you all again for attending. Thanks, Stan, once again. Big round of applause to you, and have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Davis. Love you, Davis. Thank you for coming. These leave takings are so abrupt, but that's Zoom for you, so I'm going to Zoom.